morning, ladies and gentlemen. We will start. My name is Dana Al-Kurd. I am an assistant professor here at the Doha Institute. We'll start panel 6. I'll switch to English now.
We have with us today researcher Mr. Gregory Waters, who is a researcher and writer on the Syrian civil war and extremist groups, primarily utilizing Syrian community Facebook pages. He received his MA in Global Studies from the University of California, Berkeley, and today he'll be presenting on Assad's militias, strength through decentralization. So all of the researchers know they have about 15 to 20 minutes, and I'll give you a signal at that time. All right.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. Like I said, I'll be talking about loyalist militias, Syrian loyalist militias, not foreign loyalist militias. We'll briefly go over why they formed, and then we'll look at the attempts at integration, why they've failed, and why I believe that they will continue to fail. So, very quickly, the structure of the Syrian army in 2011, at the beginning of the war. It's really important to understand what the army looked like when the war started and why it collapsed, because that is directly related to why militias formed and how they formed. So if you start with over here, sorry for the blurry image, but generally speaking, over here you have the so-called elite majority Alawite forces, the 4th Division, the Republican Guard, and the independent special forces regiments. Oh yes, thank you. Then over here, on this side is what we would refer to as the regular Syrian army. This is the mostly conscript Sunni forces and where most of the defections occurred from. These are color-coded. This picture was made by Joseph Holliday in 2013. It's really his work that we build off of for what happened to the army in the early years. But the key here really is because of the defections and the distrust in the larger Sunni conscript regular army, the way that the army was deployed in the first 3 years was that elements of the regular brigades here would be picked off. So you'd have, a quarter, 1 battalion from each brigade that could be trusted or that was still intact. And it would be deployed alongside a company or battalion size element of these elite, loyal Alawite units. For 2 reasons. One, these units were there to observe the Sunni conscript regular army. If there were attempts at defections, they would execute them or arrest them. And also these had better training equipment. There's more armored forces, special forces, that kind of thing. But in doing so, this broke the chain of command. After years of being deployed, you can see here the color coding. You see special forces units, like a regiment would have, it's 3 or 4 battalions spread across the country for a year plus. By the end of this, when you put on top of that the level of officers being killed, you no longer have a functioning unit. And by mid-war, these really become irrelevant. The special forces no longer exist today in any real capacity. The Republican Guard, it gets broken down, it gets relied upon so much, and there never has a break in which it can rebuild and recoup these officer corps losses and kind of fix the administrative ties that have been broken by being split across the country. So now, Republican Guard we look at today is not an elite unit, and it is very much represents militia structures. It has been rebuilt by incorporating militias, an attempt to do so, but in doing so, it has mirrored the militia structures that it has tried to incorporate. So that's a very brief overview of what happened to the army. And as it broke apart, as it was spread across the country, loyalist militias formed to essentially, initially as auxiliary units. But then sometimes it was that you couldn't send an army unit to a particular front. And so you had to form a loyalist militia to defend or to go on the offensive. So we can kind of broadly break these down into 6 typologies, 6 categories. Private funded militias, which would be like the Desert Hawks, probably the most famous version of that, the Jabr family, an Alawite business family from the coast, just immensely rich and makes a private military, for its own illegal activities and to fight. You have foreign-founded Syrian militias. Basically, it would be like Arab Nationalist Guard, or these militias that kind of incorporate Syrians alongside foreigners. The intelligence-founded militias would be the largest of these, probably, of all militias. So this is, the different intelligence branches go around and they use their money and their connections and their officers to form militias. The Tiger Forces are the most famous example of this. Tiger Forces are an Air Force intelligence branch founded militia. At the core of the Tiger Forces are Air Force intelligence officers. And then they incorporated local Hama and Homs militias as they grew. They also kind of stole units and officers from the 4th Division's 555th Regiment and from some SAA units. You have Army. The Army itself also created militias in various parts of the country to support their own efforts. Because the Army, the Syrian Army was formed with one intention, right? It's Israel. It's everything about it was directed towards Israel and later Lebanon. So each division had specific geographic areas in which it was based, and which it had, its responsibility for an inevitable war with Israel. So when the war breaks out and the revolution breaks out, these divisions are able to kind of lean on these geographic areas and recruit heavily from the locals there and form auxiliary militias that they can then use to augment their losses and their activities. 5, and this is, I think, most important, is military units that become militias due to the losses that they take. And we'll get into an example of that in a second here. So that being said, nothing is this clear. These breakdowns are much blurrier. There is no, I don't think you could find a single militia that only fit into one of those categories. So here's an example of just some militias. And the important thing here is look at the sponsor. So the sponsor would be, the group that founded it, that funds them, and that has some degree of control over them. That degree of control could be no control to complete control. And you can see, there are very few that have just one sponsor. And even when they have one sponsor, for example, the 4th Division sponsored ones, they're reporting, the 4th Division itself is not what we consider a conventional SAA unit. It has its whole political economy. It has a security branch, a civilian officer sector that's kind of parallel to the military officer structure. So these are very complex groups that will move between sponsors as they need. I think the most probably best example of that is the Qalamun Shield Forces, which had 4 different sponsors. Well, they don't have 4 sponsors all at once. They moved between these sponsors. The group split. I believe it began as a 3rd Division militia because it's from North Qalamun, which is where the 3rd Division is based, and it was formed as they decided to kind of start conducting offensive operations in the region. They took loyalist communities, formed them into this new militia to help the 3rd Division regular units. As they took areas, they then, the process of reconciliation began, and those men who reconciled would be brought into the Qalamun Shield Forces to grow it. But within the first year, I believe, the militia starts seeking new sponsorship. It goes to the Republican Guard, Air Intel and Mil Intel. All of these start coming in because they're looking for funding. They're looking for, more leeway. Militias, they always want more freedom in what they do, especially when you're looking at militias that incorporate reconciled rebels, which, as you can see, most militias do incorporate reconciled rebels to some point, especially these are all southern Syrian militias. And that's a problem, because reconciliation, this idea that over the last 3-4 years, the regime starts to retake a lot of towns now, a lot of communities, and it can use these men, these former rebels, former just civilians who lived in these opposition areas, it can use them to replenish its losses, to rebuild the army, and to bring power back to the state, because these militias are operating in a pseudo, partially outside of the state control. But what we see is that time and time again, reconciled areas, the one of the key conditions for reconciliation is the formation of their own militia, because they don't trust, rightly so, joining the regular army. They know that if I join the SAA, I'm going to be sent to the Badia to fight ISIS and I will die. And it will be because they're sending me out to kill me, right? So we want to form our own militia. You can see some of those here, the founded post-reconciliation. These two were in the Beit Jin area, and the condition was we will form our own militia, we will defend this area. Oftentimes they try to say you will not send us outside the governorate in which we live, which was okay back in 2016, 17, 18 when in Damascus you still had East Ghouta, southern Damascus, various pockets. So if you're from Beit Jin, you can go fight in East Ghouta and you're not being sent outside of your governorate. But now, Damascus is cleared, so they're starting to be sent to other parts of the country. So really what I'm trying to get at here is that, one, militias' ties to the government are very complicated and multidimensional. The strength of these ties varies. You have, for example, the Coastal Shield Brigade in Latakia. It's an Alawite loyalist unit. Its officers are paid by the Republican Guard. And a couple years ago, the Republican Guard said, okay, you must now join the 103rd Regiment of the Republican Guard, Brigade of the Republican Guard, because we need to rebuild it and we need to integrate you. And they thought, because we pay the officers, you will have to do what we say. And they just say no, because they have other sources of funding. And because the state is so weak, it can't, what will it do if you don't integrate? They still rely on this unit to defend the mountains of Latakia. So these are the many ways in which the integration attempts have failed. Here's some data on, if we look at how the actual implementation of army units and militias in the fighting. This is based on publicly reported regime deaths and the units that were reported for each of the soldiers that died. So if we say during this period, for about half of the men that were reported killed, about half of those men had units attached to them. And we can look at this and we can see in the blue would be what we consider official government units. Green would be considered militias, and the orange 4th Division is kind of in between. And you can see, in 2017 and 2018, it's mostly militias that are being, whose members are being reported killed. Even post the capture of Damascus, of southern Syria, you'd think, you've had several years now of rebuilding efforts under Russian, Russian rebuilding efforts of the SAA. Even in 2019, you still see a huge presence of militias, importance of militias in fighting on the front lines. So we can look at, people say, well, the army is majority Sunni still. But most of those Sunni units are not deployed. They're not trusted. They remain in their barracks. They remain in the south, manning checkpoints. Frontline units are these militias that are overwhelmingly minority militias. So, and then here in 2020, this is, mostly Aleppo and Idlib fighting, but also in Deir ez-Zor. Again, you can see Tiger forces remain an immensely important militia within the government. State security, again, if you're thinking why is state security 10% of deaths in 2020? This is an issue. This is an issue for the government, that they're relying on the intelligence, on members of their mukhabarat to fight on the front lines. So really quickly, I want to go into one partially successful attempt at integration. The Tiger forces, as I said, were an Air Force intelligence founded unit. It mixed Air Force intelligence, special operations soldiers, some special forces recruits, but mostly local militias. Here is an attempt at an order of battle for them, and it's an attempt because you cannot make an order of battle because it is a militia. But you can see all of these in bold are various militias based around local warlords. They recruit, the leader of it is a local strongman, and then when offensive is launched, they will report to the Tiger forces or report to the front line, and there's an officer corps that coordinates between all of these. This is not a proper military structure, but in August of 2019, Rami Makhlouf, a cousin of Assad, a very influential businessman who was a major funder of the Tiger forces, had his assets seized. And immediately, the SAA High Command, to which this did not report, takes the Tiger forces away from the Air Force intelligence and brings it under their command. This is a major power move by Minister of Defense Ali Ayoub, who recently become Minister of Defense. And the Tiger forces are slowly being integrated into a new division called the 25th Division, which is being merged with the 5th Corps. So we're seeing one successful attempt by the Russians and the SAA High Command to strengthen, direct command over important militias. The 5th Corps is a Russian-backed project, Russian-controlled project, but also SAA High Command controlled. Tiger forces now report to them rather than to the Air Force intelligence. And in this same process, we're also seeing it actually starts to look more like an army. We could take this and we can actually, now, we can make it look more like this. It has regiments and battalions that all of those groups that were up there are now underneath. And those regiments and battalions are commanded by men with actual army ranks. And slowly, what I've been told is that the idea is the kind of old guard, Tiger forces, strongmen, warlords, well, we're going to use them up until they're dead, weak, and then we will finish this full integration into a proper military structure. So this is one strong attempt, and I think an important thing to take away from that is it shows that Russia's primary objective now, having secured the Assad regime, is to bring back that monopoly of violence to the army and try and deal with this militia issue. I just don't see it being very successful beyond this, though, for the reasons we've talked about. I think I'm out of time now, so I'll end it there. Thank you.
I was willing to give you a few more minutes. But if you want to stop, that's fine.
I can go for a lot more.
Okay, thank you very much for the very thorough breakdown. ثانيا معنا اليوم الأستاذ حمزة مصطفى، طالب دكتوراه في جامعة أكسيتر وباحث مساعد في المركز العربي، حاصل على الماجستير من
He has the PhD from this institute, and he'll be talking about the combat performance of Al-Nusra Front, the transition from Jihadist militia to the Syrian Salvation Government's army. 15 minutes, please.
طب أنا فيني بلش عبين ما
ما في
صباح الخير.
Good morning.
هلا فيما يتعلق بالبحث
As far as the research is concerned, it was supposed to present a new kind of saying when it comes to Al-Nusra Front and its transition from a militia that was adept at following the guerrilla warfare into becoming a quasi kind of army, the Salvation Army, the Salvation Government that was declared in Idlib when Al-Nusra controlled the Idlib province in 2017, and the new identity of Al-Nusra. But the head of the Al-Nusra Front had conducted an interview with the International Crisis Group one day before the conference, and he declared similar outcomes. So perhaps this research paper is not a novelty, but I would like to say that it was spot on. As you can see, I have highlighted it in red. The Julani said that the HTS presents itself today as a local group independent of Al-Qaeda's chain of command with a strictly Syrian, not transitional Islamic agenda, and it adapted itself to the new kind of war circumstances. Al-Julani talked about a new relationship with the opposition after he quelled the opposition in Idlib, repressed the opposition in Idlib. He talked about a good relationship. He talked about about allowing the international kind of NGOs to come back to the Idlib and carry out the kind of work. He as well, he in addition to that presented us with functional kind of clear messages whereby he said that during the last 6 months he worked on obliterating all ISIS cells in Idlib, as well as containing the organization of the religious guardians or Hurras ad-Din, those who dissociated themselves from Al-Nusra, and they wanted to lean to Al-Qaeda anew. He talked about the Kurdistan Islamic party, whereby the Uyghur combatants do fight under its umbrella. He alluded to this Kurdistan party, but they all kind of acknowledge the fact that there is a salvation government whereby he would be heading. What we would like to say is not new, but we'd like to talk about the two questions: why and how. Why these transitions took place and how these transitions took place, and to that end I would like to talk about the impact of such transitions on the combating performance within the framework of a number of criteria that were alluded to since the start of Dr. Ashur's intervention and throughout the sessions of this conference. There are three names of Al-Nusra Front. The first one was indeed Jabhat al-Nusra. It was a Salafi jihadi group. 2012, after the Jaish al-Fatah and the Idlib conquest, the Al-Nusra dissociated itself from Al-Qaeda, and later on when it was victorious, it became HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the Levant Liberation Organization, and then the Syrian Salvation government came along in 2017. We do understand that there are three kind of terms that they cleave to, especially when it comes to the radical Islamist kind of movement. However, to a certain extent, if we follow certain discourse analysis tools to the Julani discourse, we do understand that he repeats a number of terms whereby he, to a certain extent, is adamant on the context, is adamant on the impact of the external kind of environment and so on and so forth. So this part will resemble a theoretical kind of framework which overcomes a number of organizational kind of nuances that relate to the Islamist movements, whereby some might look at such movements as if they are community-based that are prone to external kind of impacts. So as far as the levers or the impact of the structure, I quoted Dr. Ashur's, and here I say it has nothing to do with the two, but it is a process. It is neither agency nor structure, it's a process, and that's why I resorted to the political process approach in order to understand these kind of transitions in accordance with the social process theory, whereby it sheds light on the radicalization processes, and it also alluded to the de-radicalization and the moderation, and also the social movement theory. How could we translate the grievances within the framework of demands and ideologies that are capable of recruitment? And in order for me not not to look at these movements as if they were subject to certain impacts, I resorted to the charismatic leadership component, whereby the charismatic leadership played a major role not only in Al-Nusra but in all the Syrian factions. Al-Nusra front was a transformation within the Salafi jihadist trend, and it related to the failure of the experience in Iraq, as well as the competition between the theoreticians of the jihadists, whereby what jihad might look like. So the Al-Nusra front were impacted by Abu Mus'ab as-Suri's literature. I can touch upon three: the Sunnah in opposition to the Jews and the Crusaders, and the Nusayrites or the Alawites. And here Abu Mus'ab as-Suri is the preacher. He is the kind of the theoretician, and I have revised his books, and as a matter of fact the outcome might be wrong, because he looks at the internal enemy as if it is a part and parcel of the external one, and that's why perhaps they understood him wrongly. There are also different observations when it comes to the modus operandi of the Nusra. So there are three kind of observations that are theoretical. There is no strategy, there is no kind of jihadi related theory, and the issue of the performance is also can be put under the limelight of criticism. Abu Mus'ab as-Suri resorted to saying that these kind of movements can be destructive if they don't cleave to the guerrilla war that is long term. And here in this chart we can, or rather the global Islamist jihad call that starts from a cell. He, as a matter of fact, created the structure of the jihadi work, whereby there is no centrism, but this might depend on certain decentralized kind of movements, and that's why he called it a modus operandi rather than an organization, and he differentiated between the modus operandi of the traditional movement, and he said that these are fruitless. So this legacy was there at the Nusra front, but it couldn't adopt it 100%, despite the fact that it was adopted mostly because there was no emir, there was no caliph, there was a general commander. There was nothing to do with the pursuit of establishing a government. There was, as a matter of fact, different kind of maneuvers that they followed. As far as the combat performance is concerned, they followed the tactics rather than strategies when it comes to the Al-Nusra front since the start of 2014. It was also an organized guerrilla warfare, and it wasn't purely a jihadist kind of performance, and the outcomes were very fruitful, because it affected especially 2014, it affected the retreat of the Syrian Arab army to retreat and to lose land to the tune of 60%. There's also what we call the explosives, as well as the Inghimasiyyin, or the infiltrators, as well as the IEDs. The close also quarter technique, what we call also the shelling from afar, or the unguided shelling, as well as the besieging of important sites, outposts, to gain certain spoils, because of Mus'ab as-Suri wanted to focus, as a matter of fact, on the local kind of context rather than the external one. However, when the ISIS question came along, Al-Jabha, the Al-Nusra front faced a zero-sum game, and that's why there were no choices except Al-Qaeda, and thus at the time Al-Nusra front was about to disintegrate, but certain Syrian factions supported it. The ISIS discourse was more impactful to recruit some of its combatants, and that's why Al-Jolani in Idlib wanted to have an Islamic emirate or in the north of Syria. However, Jabhat al-Nusra, after overcoming the dilemma of ISIS in 2017, indeed had into place for the first time a coherent structure, a coherent hierarchy when it comes to the operations and the command, and it had joined the conquest army or Jaysh al-Fatah, and it was the sole kind of power in Idlib. As we know, ISIS before Al-Mosul is one organization, and it is another when it comes to the post-Mosul era. And Jabhat al-Nusra as well can be compared to ISIS because it was one organization before Idlib and it turned into another after Idlib. It had anti-aircraft autocannons, light and medium artillery, Cornet and Tau anti-tank missiles, as well as snipers and special forces when it established the government. And this took place since 2017, and the fighting style became different because it resorted to the ATGM at the time, as well as the manpads, which played a major role in its fighting in Idlib. The Cornet as well were spoils that it took from the Syrian regime, as well as the Tau that it took from certain different factions, the American famous weapon. In addition to that, Jabhat al-Nusra acquired a limited number, perhaps 2 to 4 anti-aircraft missiles that were Chinese, and in addition to that, Jabhat al-Nusra, because it was compelled to fight the opposition factions, Zinki, Ahrar al-Sham, the Free Syrian Army, it had put into place a snipers kind of team, as well as the special forces, what it called the Red Brigade, and it was very close to Al-Jolani, to the top commander. I think it was to do with protecting Al-Jolani, because Al-Jolani took the Al-Nusra left and right. It started from the global Salafi Jihadist movement, and it turned into a local Jihadi movement. He resorted to Jihadis from abroad, and they played a major role in the Shura Council, and then he dispensed with them and brought along Syrians, and that's why he organized these special forces to protect him. So the Al-Nusra front, and as a matter of fact, I said in the first part, when it was a jihadi militia that followed the guerrilla warfare, its impact was very influential. But after the Russian interference, we moved from talking about it as a rebellion kind of movement into talking about it differently. We are talking about Jabhat al-Nusra as if it is a quasi kind of organized group. Unfortunately, in accordance with what takes place in Syria, the Syrian army is advancing, and thus the Jabhat al-Nusra's performance has been lackluster. I would like to give you certain examples. In accordance with the Sochi Accord, Jabhat al-Nusra acceded to this accord, and there was the Morik battlefield, which started from April up until 2000 or April 2019 until August 2019, and it was just a small village on the international motorway in Hama. Khan Sheikhun, Marat Aman and Saraqib fell, all of them, within a week. The second one, or the first one fell within a week, the second one fell within 2 weeks, and the third one fell within 2 or 3 hours. So in the past, but as a matter of fact, Al-Nusra has changed, and it is now kind of a cocoon kind of movement, especially because of the Turkish interference, the Russian interference, the other superpowers interference. Perhaps Al-Nusra would resort to suicide kind of tactics against the other factions, or especially Ahrar al-Sham and the National Front for Liberation, or it might retreat to Al-Zawiya mountain and Al-Latakia and resort back to the guerrilla warfare. Perhaps this will be an introduction or a prelude to accede to the National Front of Liberation, because it is because part and parcel of the National Army. Thank you.
شكرا حمزة. أخيرا last but not least معنا الدكتور أحمد حسين، باحث في المركز العربي وحاصل على شهادة الدكتوراه في العلاقات الدولية من جامعة فرنسا في إيطاليا. اليوم راح يقدم على كيف أسست حماس جيشها، تطور العمل العسكري لكتائب عز الدين القسام في فلسطين.
Established its army and عز الدين القسام brigades. Thank you Dana, and thank you to you all, ladies and gentlemen. The prime objective of this study is to respond to the question how Hamas established its military forces or its arm.
هناك مجموعة من الفرضيات التي حكمت هذا العمل. الفرضية الأولى تتحدث عن أن هناك استقطاب جيلي داخل الحركة الإسلامية في فلسطين لعب دورا أساسيا في تطور العمل العسكري خلال الفترة ما بين 1967 أي بعد حرب حزيران حتى انطلاق حركة حماس عام 1987. الفرض الثاني أن هناك نوع من التكامل بين أجهزة الحركة سواء في الداخل أو في الخارج. في مشكلة في الصوت. الفرض الثاني إذن هناك نوع من التكامل بين جهاز الحركة في الداخل والخارج الذي ساهم في أيضا تطور العمل العسكري، خاصة وجود ما يسمى جهاز فلسطين الذي
which contributed to the establishment of Hamas's military arm and the so-called Jihadist Palestine, or the Palestine apparatus, and Hamas's political bureau. The third assumption here, which is like theoretical grounding, Hamas is a non-state actor after all, and its interaction with the regional and international order has formulated a new identity for the movement since its establishment in 1987. And Hamas determines its interests both regionally and internationally according to this principle. The second point which must be mentioned is that Hamas is an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood which was established in Egypt by Hassan al-Banna, and when the entity of Israel was established in 1948, the Muslim Brotherhood participated in the fighting, but in the period from 1948 until 1967, I could not find evidence of the Muslim Brotherhood engaging in actual fighting, maybe because in that period the group was involved in building a real Islamic or Islamist generation who believe in the fighting for the cause of Islam. But 1967, of course, was a huge shock to all political affiliations in the Muslim world, including the Muslim Brotherhood. I found this booklet, which was issued by or published by the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan, and in it they explain that this setback and defeat was a punishment from God because people have moved away from God. After that, there's been a new development, and through the appearance of a new generation, which was by and large both at the grassroots level and the leadership level, which was inclined towards fighting and jihad. Even Hassan al-Banna was not against the principle itself, but he believed more in preparing the ground before engaging in any fighting. Vis-a-vis this old generation, there was the generation of the youth who were more inclined towards fighting, but because they are obliged and they are under an oath of allegiance to the leadership, they did not embark on fighting. And there is, in that era, there was the so-called the Qutbi phenomena. This is named after Sayyid Qutb, a well-known ideologue for the jihadi thinking and ideology. At that time also, there was the so-called Executive Council for the Muslim Brotherhood, which started coordinating with the Fatah movement in Palestine, which laid the foundation for contributing to a war of liberation later on. In the memoirs of Ibrahim Ghosha, he says after the 1967 war, the youth, and he was one of them at that time, who tried to start a movement of correction, as he calls it, but the leadership of the group managed to contain that effort. Ahmed Yassin also, in his testimony through the Al Jazeera program, he also spoke of the conditions which were not ripe at that time, and we notice now this influence of Sayyid Qutb, Adnan Qutb, one of the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood and a founder of Hamas in the West Bank, also speaks of his influence when he was studying medicine in Syria, how he was influenced by this trend, and which led to confrontations with the classical leadership when he went back to the West Bank. And also other figures, Ibrahim al-Maqadma, who is considered one of the ideologues of the Islamic movement in the West Bank. He borrowed the title from Sayyid Qutb's books and added to it milestones on the road to liberating Palestine. And also other authors also spoke of the reasons hindering the Muslim Brotherhood's ability to wage war and jihad after the 1967. All of this was happening at the time when the youth generation was pushing towards military action. In the mid-70s, the Islamist movement gained more and more prominence in Palestine, especially amongst university students, and more charitable organizations, zakat organizations, and others have been appearing in, for example, in both Nablus and Gaza and in Hebron and other towns and cities of Palestine. Similar organizations were established. They were all moving in the direction of da'wah propagation and charity work and supporting the community. And also they played a major role in interaction with outside organizations like student organizations and others. Until the launching of the Hamas movement in 1987, I think it's important to pause here with an internal conference held by the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan, which was in 1983, which is probably the launching pad, theoretically at least, for understanding the military action which followed. And Ibrahim Ghosha speaks of a paper he presented. In it, he does not mention the word military action specifically and explicitly, but the paper spoke of providing Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank with money to buy weapons, and the launching of military action was to be left to the leadership in Gaza and the West Bank to decide, but the movement can provide them with weapons. In 1983, a military committee was formed in Gaza under the leadership of Ahmed Yassin. They bought the first piece of weapons. They ended up buying 80 pieces in total, but the ideological aspect was overwhelming, more than the military professional standards. Of course, because of security leaks, the Israelis found out about this cell, and Ahmed Yassin and his colleagues were arrested. In 1983, of course, the formation of the Jihadist Palestine, or the Palestine apparatus, was formed within the Muslim Brotherhood to follow the affairs of Palestinians in Gaza and West Bank. It was made up of two generations: a generation of youth who were Palestinians living in Kuwait, Britain and others. Khalil Agha headed this apparatus, and Musa Abu Marzouk was his deputy. At that time, there was some sort of an integration or continuity of work. There was no confrontation within the factions, because by then the very notion of military action has matured amongst both generations. When Ahmed Yassin was released in 1985 in a deal to exchange prisoners, he started what was called Majd apparatus, which is the acronyms of the Organization of Security and Military Action, which to be as a security apparatus. And one faction of the part of it was headed by Yahya Sinwar, who heads Hamas's political bureau in Gaza now. And of course, Gaza has always had precedence because the necessity for having a political entity and a military entity gave Gaza an advantage point. And under these circumstances, in 1987, Hamas was born as a movement, and there was a security apparatus called Majd, and a military wing was called the Palestinian Mujahideen. And the first operation, they managed to launch an operation and capture 2 Israeli soldiers, Afi Sartos and Ilan Sadoun, and this was a real test. The movement after that was subjected to a clampdown, and it was a real test for the movement. They almost entirely disappeared from the face of earth to avoid the arrest. Of course, Musa Abu Marzouk then moved from the United States back to Gaza, and he rebuilt the structure of the movement almost from scratch. And this time round, the political action was separated from military action, and the military wing was named the As-Saddin Al-Qassam Brigade. And there are a number of military communiques after the Intifada, which used to document the military action under different names, like As-Saddin Qassam Brigades in Rafah and others. For this reason, military action in the West Bank and Gaza was coordinated under the umbrella name or umbrella organization name of As-Saddin Al-Qassam Brigades. In the West Bank, Saleh Al-Aruri, who currently is the deputy leader of Hamas, or the deputy to the head of Hamas's political bureau, started in the late 90s forming resistance cells, and in the memoirs of Musa Abu Marzouk there is mention of how money used to come from outside for weapons to be bought to resist the Israeli occupation. In 1995 there was an attempt to liberate Palestinian prisoners through to capture an Israeli soldier and exchange him for the Palestinian prisoners. This led to the necessity of establishing a political bureau to run the affairs of the movement outside, and Musa Abu Marzouk held the leadership of that Politburo, and then he held a meeting with Yasser Arafat, so to get to know what this new movement was thinking of. So therefore the establishment of Hamas's political bureau abroad was a turning point which strengthened and consolidated the Palestinian action in general, and also the military action in Gaza and the West Bank, which was not well organized. There was no mention of As-Saddin Qassam brigades as such. They were incohesive and they were not as organized as now and able to analyze situations, take decisions at a collective level. At the end of the 90s, the Israelis, in collaboration with the Palestinian Authority security apparatus, managed to clamp down and kill a lot of leaders of the armed group, and Israel managed to kill him and get its hands on the entire archives of the organization, and therefore get to know about most of its members. When the Al-Aqsa Intifada or uprising came, it launched or relaunched the military action again, because in 1998 the military action mostly disappeared, but now they managed to reorganize themselves and depending on those who were Al-Qassam members who were imprisoned by the Palestinian Authority, and after their release they contributed to this. In the period between 2000 to 2005 there was a reconstitution of the military action of the Al-Qassam, and Hussam Badran also in his book saying that military action used to rely on independent cells, and each cell was considered an independent military wing which carried out operations according to its own capabilities. So we're not talking about a hierarchy or command structure. Every cell was tasked with launching operations according to their ability. Then the question of Israel's withdrawal from Gaza and Hamas's engagement in political work and elections, and all this talk about mixing between the military action and political activity and the eventual control of Gaza by Hamas, and also they expelled all the leadership of the Palestinian Authority and security apparatus, and in return, of course, the Palestinian Authority did the same to the followers of Hamas, which weakened Hamas in the West Bank but strengthened it in Gaza. After the Intifada, we must pay some attention also to the question of the support Hamas managed to get through the so-called the resistance axis and their good relations with Syria, Iran, Qatar and Turkey, which consolidated its military capabilities. Abdul Hakim Hanawi in his book explains how this support through training, arming, and he explains how consignments of weapons used to come from Sudan via Sinai or through road routes, set land routes. We don't have accurate figures as to the membership of Qassam brigades. There is some estimates say there are 6 brigades, and each brigade is, we cannot see the PowerPoint from this distance. Also, the structure is similar to regular armies. There is a supreme military council, and Ahmed al-Ja'bari, the deputy leader of Al-Qassam, also explains how there are special units or departments which is really similar to a large extent to regular armies, and they also provide details as to how a volunteer is selected to join the ranks of Hamas. I'll go back in history a little bit. In my research and preparing this paper, in Gaza, anybody who is involved in military action is described as someone working on the positive side. I'll conclude by also developing the military manufacturing capabilities, and since 2008, 2012, and the confrontations with Israel prove that the military or the military manufacturing capability in Gaza, which belong to Hamas, are proving being more sophisticated with the passage of time. Of course, we're not talking about a balance between their capabilities and the capabilities of Israel, but as a national liberation movement, they managed to establish some sort of a deterrence with Israel through manufacturing rockets and missiles. The idea goes back to 2001 in 26 October, the first locally manufactured missile hit the Sderot settlement, and this know-how was also it was transferred to the West Bank, and from there missiles were fired at Israel. Qassam 1 and Qassam 2, when were used between 2002 and 2005, were very poorly guided. They did not have a proper guidance system, but their impact was psychological. But the later modules proved to be more accurate, and they had better guidance systems. The names have changed recently. Now they are named after the fallen leaders of Hamas, like M75 after Ibrahim Maqadma, and the M67 after Abdelaziz al-Rantisi, and also G70 after another leader, Ahmed Jabari. Also, the usage of the Cornet anti-tank missiles made in Russia was another development. In 2012 war, the Qassam Brigade started or appeared to be behaving like a proper army, benefiting from the accumulation of their expertise. Fajr Khamsa was used for the first time, another type of missile. In 2014, these missiles or rockets managed to halt the aviation movement in Israel when they landed near Israeli airports. This RPG, rocket-propelled grenade launcher, is called Yasin, is locally manufactured in Gaza. Also, other they have a Shuwad 7, which is a warhead which is able to penetrate the Merkava tanks. The first tunnel which was built was 2001 for fighting purposes. This was in the Egyptian-Palestinian border area, and Hamas continued using these tunnels for economic, commercial reasons and fighting wars. And in the last confrontation with Israel, the tunnels were extensively used, and this has brought a new element into the rules of engagement, and also they are able to plan sea landing operations. The latest development is the development of drones, and this started by the Ababil 1 model, which was started by a Palestinian engineer who studied in Iraq, in Baghdad, and therefore the Palestinians call this drone the Iraqi drone. وأيضا هناك there is the different versions of the Ababil. Some are used to attack, to drop bombs, others in suicide missions. In the period from 1948 to 1967, and the Islamic movement by and large has not advanced to the extent of establishing a military action wing because at that time the Palestinian left-wing organizations and the PLO were more in prominence. Secondly, between 1967 and 1987, the second generation of the Islamic movement managed to start a semi-organized military action. From 1987 till 2000, the work was better organized. There was a political bureau active outside, and the military wing inside, and they coordinated better, they integrated their actions, but the Israeli clampdown has weakened a lot this movement. In the period post-2000, after the Intifada, of course, the military action came back to prominence again, and Hamas utilized its relations with Turkey, Iran, Syria, and other countries. And later on, in the last three confrontations with Israel, the Azzedine Al-Qassam's group has developed into a semi-professional regular army unit, and also in Gaza there is local support, and the population is also you see in this photograph there is the flag of Palestine on the battle fatigues worn by the Qassam fighters. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much. You exceeded your time limit, but thank you anyway. We'll open the floor for questions and answers. Thank you very much. We'd like to thank the panelists. Two questions posed to Mr. Hamzeh. The first question is to do with the command and control, or the commanders, or the command apparatus at Al-Nusra. Supposedly, the Julani must be in Idlib, and the units will spread from Qunaitra to Dara to the countryside. What about the logistics? Another question to Mr. Ahmed Hussein. We do understand that the jihad movement in Palestine is another important movement. What about the dialectics or the relationship between the jihad movement and Hamas? And what about the relationship between Hamas and Iran from one hand, and Hamas and Egypt from another? Especially when Egypt and Iran are at loggerheads at certain stages. Another question? Yes, my question is to Mr. Gregory about the Syrian Arab Army, the SAA. Despite the fact that it had a bit disintegrated, but still it is coherent, and it defends the regime, because the Syrian chiefs were a part and parcel of the Ba'ath party, and they were and still loyal to the regime. I would like you to diagnose the SAA's status. The other issue is to do with the Iranian militias and the Afghani militias, the Iraqi militias in Syria. And what about the level of coordination between these militias and the regime? This is the second question. My question to Mr. Mustafa. What's expected when it comes to the showdown between the Syrian army and the Al-Nusra front? The Syrian army is on the offensive in Idlib province. Any comment on the potential showdown between the two? I would like to thank you. I would like to thank Mr. Ahmed for his Hamas-related paper. I have two questions. When we talk about Hamas and compare its covenant in 1987 and the political document 2017, there is a yawning gap between the two. And indeed, politically, culturally, education-wise, things are different now. But still, to a certain extent, in principle, the fighting creed or the fighting kind of faith is still steadfast, especially when it comes to the political kind of thought as well. So how could you square this circle. The second question is as follows. Hamas is a non-state actor in the political domain as well as militarily, and it has certain representations in a number of countries, and it can maneuver abroad outside the vicinity of Gaza and the West Bank, but still it had not moved the rules of engagement outside Palestine. It didn't carry out any operations abroad. So how could we interpret kind of this status? Thank you. Perhaps we'll answer the questions first, and then we'll move for another round of questions. The first question was posed to Mr. Hamzeh. This question is very important. How the units work? How did the units work, and the geography of Al-Nusra front in Syria proper? We need to differentiate between two kind of phases. The first phase, the focus was to do with the Islamic resistance companies, whereby the bay'ah or oath of allegiance was to do with the commander of the company rather than the commander chief or the chief commander. Abu Malik al-Talli in Qalamun represented Al-Nusra front. He represented this subsidiary apart from the Raqqa, apart from Deir ez-Zor, but there was a Shura Council whereby the Shura Council had put the plans in place, the offensive plans. They were offensive in the first phase, but then it turned into becoming a defensive, and that's why they didn't kind of needed the command and control kind of center. And this had led to kind of different thoughts, different ideas. Some people said that we need to retreat, we need to retain our coherence and the outposts that we control. And that's why they retreated to Idlib. This had affected the ideology of the fighters. The ideology has changed as well. For example, all the transformations that took place were pragmatic, and they took place at the level of the commanders, and they didn't take heed of the ranks and file. The ranks and file, still Salafis, Jihadis, when you say to them that we need to look at the Syrian context rather than the other international Jihadi Salafists, they would be disgruntled, I think. The other issue after the nesting and the foundation kind of phases, first and foremost, they didn't want to deal with the civilians. But in Aleppo, when Al-Nusra participated, this had burdened it and administratively and financially. So regardless of or apart from the spoils and the weapons and so on and so forth, there were certain administrative services Al-Nusra provided, and they were lucrative indeed. For example, the Ahrar al-Sham and Al-Nusra fought amongst each other over Bab al-Hawa crossing because it was lucrative. $7 million daily used to gain because of this very important crossing. The trucks used to come and go and used to pay, as a matter of fact, for entry fees. In addition to the gas that Al-Nusra received and other kind of civilian or related or civil related sectors. Al-Nusra had 4 or 5 bakeries. Al-Nusra received $10,000 from selling bread in some part of Aleppo. As far as the expectations of the showdown with the Syrian army, there is a kind of a collective collective kind of awareness amongst the factions, the Free Syrian Army and the Jabhat al-Nusra and other factions. They do believe that the Idlib kind of battle is nothing to do with Syria. They went to Astana, they went to Sochi, even Al-Nusra that refused Sochi played a major role in protecting the patrol kind of Turkish points in that area. So these factions perhaps might be on the offensive if there was an Air Force Turkish kind of cover. But if there was no cover, then when the regime advances, we will retreat. This has different kind of elements as well, because it has become an organization and it has become kind of centralized, and it is more prone to being targeted, and the balance of power has been tilting towards the regime. So
والحديث يطول أيضا فيه.
I can talk at length about these kind of issues, but I'll stop here.
The question directed to you.
Thank you for your question. I think to look at the status of the Syrian army, today we have to first we have to separate out into two distinct things. One is the Russian attempts at rebuilding, and which is only focused on certain parts of the army, and then those parts that have not had those attempts. So there's been 4 attempts at rebuilding. The Fourth Corps, creation of the Fourth Corps, which was an idea of we're going to create a new, everything's lost, we'll make a new army, corps. It failed. Then there's the creation of the 30th Division after the fall of Aleppo, which was the idea that the Republican Guard units that had been in Aleppo for so long, for so many years, were decimated. We also have many loyalist militias. So what we do now is we merge them all together. We rebuild the Republican Guard with local militias and the remnants of various regiments and brigades. That is still ongoing. Then there's the Fifth Corps, and the Fifth Corps I think is arguably that's what we look to for the future of the army, especially with the integration of the Tiger forces now into it. And the Fifth Corps again is under Russian direction, and that we're seeing both the integration of militias and of ex-rebels. So again, there's finite resources, right, to rebuild the army, and the more resources directed to the Fifth Corps, the less resources there are to direct towards the old SAA divisions and brigades. That being said, there are certain specific divisions, sometimes a whole division, sometimes a single brigade within a division that the Russians have prioritized. And we saw those in the spring of 2019. Every unit that had received Russian training and Russian support was deployed in North Hama for that offensive. So it was a very heavy SAA offensive along with Tiger forces. But then you look at the units out in the east, the 17th Division, the 18th Division. These units are not receiving support, and they're very weak. They have a mixture of conscripts, prisoners. It's not a good situation for them. So there's this mixture within the army. The Russians have clearly prioritized trying to rebuild it. But in terms of coordination between the Shia militias, that, at least in the recent years, I've seen only, since Russia came in, right, they're Russian-backed military units and Iranian-backed military units. And the Shia militias have largely been they stay with those Iranian-backed units. So the 4th Division will work with Shia militias because the 4th Division is Iranian, and they incorporate a lot of Shia militias inside it itself. Republican Guard works with Shia militias in Aleppo because it's have a lot of Iranian support. The Shia militias have not generally worked with or coordinated with regular SAA units or the Fifth Corps or even the Tiger forces for that matter in the recent years. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. دكتور أحمد في أظن أكثر من سؤال متوجه لك.
بالنسبة لسؤال الأستاذ إلياس.
As far as Ilyas's question, yes, the jihadi movement can be put under the limelight, especially when it comes to the Saraya al-Quds or the Al-Quds Component Foundation, and the Azzedine Al-Qassam's brigades, the military wing of Hamas. It was a complementary kind of move, albeit it was organizational. But when we go back to the military showdown between Hamas and Israel and the other factions, there were coordinations amongst the Palestinians, high coordinations between the Palestinian factions, but perhaps in the future we might see some competition, especially when it comes to the question of the resistance weapon within the ambit of the two-state solution or the one-state solution. As far as Egypt and Iran are concerned, there is the geography element that is very important when it comes to Egypt, because Egypt is resembles the lung of the Gazans, 2 million of them, and that's why Hamas and the Islamic resistance, Hamas controls sector Gaza, and it follows the carrot and stick tactics. It cannot kind of confront Egypt or confront any other country, and it wants to maintain the Islamic kind of an Arab depth of such movement. As far as the discourse analysis of the kind of foreign policy of Hamas, we might it transpired that some lean towards the Islamic world, others lean towards the Arab kind of dimension, and that's why we need perhaps to separate the Arab from the Islamic, and some people say no, it has to be combined. As far as the representative of Hamas and his arrest in Saudi Arabia, this news were kind of obfuscated, and Hamas provided us with a statement later on. So they want to kind of be at certain positive level of relationship with the other parties, with other stakeholders. In 2012, Fajr Khamsa's missile and Cornet was used, and the military industry was kind of booming in Sector Gaza on the part of Hamas, and Hamas was supported by different countries at the time. But when it comes to the discourse is balanced indeed when it comes to Hamas. As far as the 1988 and the covenant, as well as the political document in 2017 and the yawning gap between the two, I think here we can talk about the theoretical kind of framework of my paper. Hamas is a non-state actor, and it interacted with different kind of factions and countries in the region. When we go back to the 1988 and compare it with 2017, we see indeed that there is a transformation in the thought of Hamas, but when it comes to the critical mass or the core of Hamas, they still cleave to the previous principles, because the Politburo, when it was established, the representative thereby crisscrossed the Arab world because they wanted to gain support from the Arabs in Syria, in Sudan, in Algeria, in Iran. There were branches of the political bureau established by Hamas, because Hamas considers itself as a political liberation movement, and it wanted support, political support, military support from the Arab and Islamic world. I don't think that there's separation between the political and the military. I personally wish that the two are separated conclusively, whereby the Al-Qassam brigade might become a Palestinian national army. That's what I wish personally, whereby a national government can control such brigades. However, in 2012, things become different. Weapons from Libya and Egypt came along because Egypt at the time supported Hamas at the time of Morsi, and it received advanced weaponry. In 2017, Hamas managed the confrontation, but it was dealt with a heavy blow at the time as well. The management of such confrontations is a management whereby Hamas strikes a balance between the political and the military. Yes. I think we have only time for one or two questions. There's a lady here.
So one and then two. One over there.
أنا عندي سؤال أحمد. هو ملاحظة مش سؤال أكثر إنه وهي ملاحظة منهجية.
I have a question, or perhaps a methodological kind of observation. When we study a liberation movement, we need to put things into a context. We need to confine perhaps the analysis and the discussion within certain methodology. We can't just talk about the matter willy-nilly, if I might say, especially when it comes to Hamas, because in accordance with the international law, Hamas has the right to resistance, and this is a very important context, and I wish that you have put it into this context. Perhaps it is there in the paper, but I just wanted to attract your attention to this. You have analyzed the matter at length, and that's why we focused on the internal politics. However, I think that most importantly, when it comes to the resistance of Hamas, things had transformed into something else when it comes to the confrontation with Israel. Israel wants to obliterate the Palestinians, and that's why we need perhaps to talk about this dimension as well. I would like to give you an example. Hamas was adamant on confronting Israel because it learned from the previous experience of different encounters, and that's why perhaps you should have perhaps focused on the confrontation with Israel. Thank you. Last question. Just what about the number of militants under the umbrella of Al-Nusra, and how many Syrians? Some people on social media accused Al-Nusra of retreating, withdrawing, and they said that perhaps there is from under the table kind of discussion that goes on with the regime. What's the nature of its relationship with the other countries, if they are positive? Dr. Ahmed Hussein, what about the number of militants of Hamas, and what about those who receive wages on a monthly basis? And would it be possible for Hamas to face Israel in perhaps potential future confrontations, whereby the populace can take arms? We have only 3 minutes, so you've got only 1 minute each. Mr. Hamzeh, and then very quickly, you know, in Syria, the estimated number is 18,000, in accordance with the statements of Al-Nusra, 18,000. But the actual ones is to the tune of 6,000 to 7,000. As far as the Syrians, amongst them, all of them, or 99%, are Syrian. This applies also to the commanders. 75% of them are Syrians. As far as the discussions or the potential discussions with the regime. I think there are no discussions with the regime, no. But they are speaking to the Russians. They are sending to Hmeimim certain messages because Russia is talking about the HTS as being part and parcel and very important when it comes to Idlib. As far as the relationship with other countries, these were severed, but Al-Nusra received plenty of support in its command and control center, and Jaish al-Fatah, Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia provided Jaish al-Fatah with support, and Al-Nusra received gained benefit from combating such factions. Tau and Kornit were gained by Al-Nusra through such battles in the countryside of Hamad. So Al-Nusra received them as poles of war. Thank you, Ahmed.
Okay.
Yes, Ayat, as you know, I'm a specialist in international relations and the agent and the structure and the evolving structure or evolving identity was the methodology that I followed and the theory that I followed in my paper. As far as the context kind of analysis, I couldn't just go through all the content of the paper, but I just wanted to put into place the argument of the military kind of performance of Hamas in Palestine. As far as the confrontations are concerned, yes, I dealt with them in detail and quantitatively. I talked about the missiles that were fired and the Iron Dome and the Israel being a colonial power and an occupying power. This is kind of these kind of information are very well spread, and everybody knows that Israel is an occupying power. But I just wanted to talk about the evolvement of the militancy of Hamas. As far as the numbers, I think this is classified. I don't think that there is a source whereby we could pinpoint the exact number of the troopers of Azadin al-Qassam's brigades. But some people that the numbers are 30,000, 40,000, we don't know. The military structure is similar to the classical army, but it is not a classical army. We need to understand that the capacities are different, especially when it comes to Israel. We cannot compare Hamas to Israel because Israel has been supported by plenty of countries. Here we're talking about 80 pieces of weapons in 1980 on the part of Hamas, and in 2012 we're talking about missiles that had hit Tel Aviv and disrupted the airports, especially the Ben Gurion airport in Israel. So I think there's an evolvement that ought to be understood and revisited within the Palestinian context. Thank you very much indeed. We'll be having a break. And if you've got further questions, you can talk to the gentleman outside. Thank you.